Hey everyone, welcome to a special episode of Live with NORML. Today we'll be doing a federal marijuana policy update. It is Friday, November 14th, 2025. I'm J.M. Pedini, the Development Director here at the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. It's Friday, so not only are we going to have a special guest today, but also we're going to do our best to answer your burning questions live. So take a quick second, wherever you're watching, hit that like, follow, or subscribe button, and let us know where you are. Drop a note in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from and what questions you're going to have for us today. Hey, Samuel and Quinn. Good to see you both here. Hey, everyone who just joined us over on Instagram. I'm going to bring in today's special guest, NORML Deputy Director Paul Armentano. Hey, Paul.
Hey there, JM.
Thanks for joining us.
Of course. Hello, everybody.
Hey to Mike in Virginia Beach and Green-Eyed Wren in Houston, Farmer Drizzle in Vegas, Sarah in Arizona. Hey, Fried Mouse in Minneapolis, and John in California. Nick, welcome back as always, friend. It's been a big week for cannabis policy at the federal level, hasn't it, Paul?
Yeah, it's been a really big week, and a week that I think is going to have repercussions for quite some time.
Absolutely. So let's get right into it. We'll start with the topic that I think we've had to talk the most about this week, and this is Congress approving the funding bill that will, in a year, restrict the sales of hemp-derived intoxicating products.
Yeah, this is a really complicated issue, and it's probably going to take some time to explain. I think some folks are even wondering what this even had to do with the CR, and maybe we can start there. Because Congress did pass a continuing resolution to reopen the government and keep the government funded through January 30th. But that wasn't all that they passed when they reopened the government. They also passed 3 different appropriations bills that are bills to fund different agencies of the US government. And those were 3 separate bills to fund those agencies for 1 full year. One of those bills had to deal with funding the military, and that's something we're going to talk about later. But another one of those bills was specific to funding the USDA. And it was within that funding bill where Congress at the 11th hour inserted new provisions that will clamp down and in many ways restrict sales of many of these hemp-derived products that many folks have become accustomed to seeing being sold at various retailers in their states.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the very first questions we saw on Instagram, was about this language, and Green-Eyed Wren wants to know, how does this ban impact the medical community? Some articles are saying this is only affecting gas stations.
So again, there's a lot of nuances to this issue. There's some unknowns, as you said, and I think it's important to note, this language does not take effect until 1 year from this week. So it is possible that there could be a revisiting federally of this issue, that Congress could continue to tweak this issue between now and when it's supposed to take effect. I think it's also important to remember that various states, in fact, most states, had already enacted their own state-specific laws addressing this issue. Some states have elected to regulate these products. Other states have elected to prohibit these products. Some states have elected to prohibit some of these products and regulate other products. Those state-specific regulations largely are going to stay in place. And it's going to be very interesting to see whether lawmakers, particularly in some of these more conservative districts, I'm thinking states like Texas and Florida, where within recent months, the governors of both those states have taken steps to protect this particular hemp market, whether they're going to choose in a year or so to defy the federal government on this issue, or if they're going to dismantle their own state regulatory laws in order to comply with the federal government. My guess is a number of states are going to march forward with their own regulations despite the federal government's decision here.
It'll certainly be interesting to see, and to Green-Eyed Wren's question regarding, does this affect gas stations? So I get what they're saying.
Yeah,
Does this affect?
this bill is meant to target those particular products.
It's not
Whether
meant.
it will effectively eliminate those products will remain an open-ended question. In some jurisdictions, it might. In others, it might not. Again, we're talking about a marketplace that exists right now in a very unregulated manner in many jurisdictions. Because of the lack of regulations, we tend to see some good actors in this space. We tend to see some bad actors in this space. And unfortunately, consumers have very little ability to make a distinction between a good actor and a bad actor. My guess is that if anything, if this ban comes down and has any sort of teeth to it and is enforced, what you'll see, unfortunately, is the good actors will actually close up shop in order to comply with the law, and the bad actors will continue to persist regardless because they are bad actors.
We've certainly seen that in states that have enacted their own laws to close these perceived loopholes created by the 2018 Farm Bill, of course, and that's exactly what we've seen happen there. The good actors who want to comply with state laws, many of them have decided it's just not worth it, and they'd rather wait for more meaningful expansion in that state. But the markets remain flooded with products from not the best manufacturers.
Yeah. And I think it's important to go back and give some folks a bit of a history lesson about how we got here.
Please.
The 2018 Farm Bill didn't just for the first time legalize and create a federal legal definition of industrial hemp, as well as legalize end products that are derived from hemp. It did do that. But what it also did was it requested the US Food and Drug Administration to create regulations to govern this new commercial market that Congress was creating. Because Congress understood they were creating a market out of whole cloth, and there were no rules in that bill to govern best practices or licensing or really provide any guidance as to what this market ought to look like. Congress expected and requested the FDA to do that heavy lifting. And for years, groups like NORML and others were lobbying the FDA, appearing at FDA hearings, testifying before the FDA, and laying out our plan for what responsible regulations for this new industry ought to look like in order to provide transparency and in order to protect consumers. And the FDA for 5 years did nothing until in 2023, they threw up their hands and publicly announced that they just couldn't come up with a way to regulate this market. And since Congress was the ones, or because Congress was the body that legalized this market, it really ought to be up to Congress to figure out how to regulate it. And it's very predictable that Congress took the path of least resistance and essentially threw their hands up and said, well, we don't know how to regulate this either. We're not even going to try to regulate it. So we'll just try to put the genie back in the bottle in 1 year, which likely isn't going to happen. And certainly, there's really no examples that we can think of where by simply prohibiting a product, you drive down consumers' demand for that product. And certainly driving the production and sale of these products underground or further underground isn't going to do anything to protect consumers or facilitate consumer safety.
But Paul, isn't there something that does reduce consumer demand for these types of products?
Absolutely. There is something that dramatically reduces consumer demand for these hemp-derived products, and that's creating, legalizing, and regulating an adult use or a medical use cannabis market. In fact, we see time and time again that demand for these products is largely limited to jurisdictions where consumers don't have current access to either adult use cannabis or medical cannabis. We know that consumers desire safe and legal access to cannabis. When they can't get it, that is when they move or gravitate toward obtaining these hemp-derived alternatives. So if we ultimately wanted to limit consumers' interest in these alternative products, the most effective way to do that would be to expand consumers' access to the real thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I do want to just close the loop on Ren's question that, again, you were right in asking about gas stations. That is what this language is intended for. It's not intended for regulated programs for medical cannabis or adult use cannabis at the state level. It is intended for unregulated or poorly regulated hemp-derived products across the country.
And specifically, the language prohibits an end product that originates from hemp, but some sort of chemical synthesis occurs during the production process. Those specific products are explicitly outlawed by this. So your products that are, for instance, high in delta-8 THC, which only occurs in very nominal quantities in the hemp plant. And then when you see these products that are available at gas stations that are very high in delta-8 THC, that's because there was a synthetic conversion that took place along the way. Those products are targeted and would be prohibited. Products that create brand new novel cannabinoids out of whole cloth, like HHC, they're targeted by this. And it also says that any product that contains a total quantity of THC or similar cannabinoids, that would include your delta-8 THCA, beyond a very nominal percentage, those products are outlawed as well. And again, that would include most products that are currently available in this space.
Yeah, including some products that are labeled as CBD products that contain THC as well. The federal limit proposed in this language is 0.4 milligrams of THC
per container. And that latter term is to be defined later.
Yes, and we've also had some questions today about THCA, which of course is the precursor to THC. It is how THC is present naturally in the plant. Everything you're seeing out there that's called THCA flower, that's weed. It's just regular weed. Total THC captures that as well. That is where total THC, the term originates from, is the conversion of THCA into THC. And now states and apparently the federal government are going to use that to capture all of these derivatives and isomers as well.
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying that, the federal government is getting involved in this issue now. But again, most states have been paving their own path when it comes to how they want to deal with these products. I believe in 24 states right now, these products at the statewide level have already been prohibited. And then in the remaining states have taken varied approaches to how they want to regulate some of these products or all of these products. And again, as we've seen with medical marijuana, with adult use cannabis markets, states can defy and will outright defy the federal government if they want to classify and regulate conduct with respect to cannabis that differs from federal prohibition. The majority of states already do that now, and I would imagine some, at least some, will choose to do that with respect to these hemp products.
You know, we have an interesting comment from Michael here. I'm going to show that. I also want to say, hi, Veronica. Yes, we are live. Hey, also to John and Tamara and Richard and William and Salem and Brady and TC. Good to see you, friend. Michael says this. So technically, this new ban is reaffirming marijuana prohibition, even in legal states?
No, I wouldn't say that. Again, this specific legislation is redefining under federal law what constitutes hemp and what constitutes a legal hemp-derived product. It is not addressing the status of cannabis under federal law, and it's not directed at, nor is it targeting the states that currently regulate adult use cannabis markets or medical cannabis markets. Those markets, let's be clear, those markets are already in violation of federal law. The Congress didn't need to pass new language to make those markets any more inconsistent with federal law than they already are.
Right. I think it does demonstrate that so many members of Congress are, however, wedded to marijuana prohibition. Not that there isn't a need to take action on these unregulated products to protect consumers. Is this the right approach? No, it's not the approach that we've ever advocated for. We've said consistently since 2019, products like this ought to be regulated.
Yeah, it's using a sledgehammer when Congress ought to have been using a scalpel. But to be fair, this really wasn't something that I think Congress as an entire body was particularly behind, nor do I think they particularly cared about. We were aware of these efforts, and this language had been floating around for a couple of years. But as a standalone effort, it never gained any traction in Congress. And I don't think it would have gained any traction this go around either, except for the fact that one of the handful of members on the conference committee on the USDA bill was Senator Mitch McConnell. And he wanted this language included. He got it included. And then there was essentially no further debate or discussion about it. And he knew he was getting this language included in legislation that we tend to call must-pass legislation. This was part and parcel with opening up the government after the longest shutdown in U.S. history. Mm-hmm. He knew that this was neither the time nor the place where members of Congress were going to continue to delay reopening the government simply to discuss this particular issue. And that tells me that he and the handful of proponents he had in Congress had no confidence that this issue, this ban, could go through regular order. Again, it had to be snuck in the middle of the night when very few people were paying attention, and then it had to be included in something that Congress felt obligated to pass.
And that's how they like to do it. We're going to talk about how they did that again in another bill in just a minute. Another a funding bill. Is there anything else we want to hit on this hemp move before we move on? Other than to I have to say this, Tom, thank you for your fantastic comment. And this is absolutely must see Friday night TV, Friday afternoon TV, if you will. If you got any nerdy
on the West Coast,
you got any nerdy questions for us? You drop those in the comments right now.
Yeah, I would just add that if folks that are listening continue to have questions, please raise them in the chat, and I'm perfectly happy to come back and circle back and revisit the issue, because like I said, it is nuanced, it is complex, and again, I think it bears repeating that this particular change in federal policy, this change in the legal definition of hemp, has not yet taken effect Yes, the language has been passed, but the effective date of this language is still 1 year away. So there is the possibility that things could change between now and then.
Yeah, there certainly is. And not only are we sure to see heavy, heavy lobbying from those who are in this industry, but I think we'll also see heavy, heavy lobbying continuing from the alcohol industry that very much wants to control this space.
It's possible. This move comes only weeks after a handful of chain stores. I know Target was one, maybe Circle K was another. These stores talked about rolling out product lines of hemp-derived drink products nationwide. Um, it'll be very interesting to see how they respond.
It sure will be, and then I would encourage everyone to keep their eyes on where the money's coming from. We have had a few questions about how will this impact seeds and how will this impact growers, and I don't think we're anywhere in the position yet to know what the ultimate outcome is going to be. But generally, I think the DEA has been pretty clear on seeds that they consider seeds to not have to be hemp because they do not have THC in them. So.
Yeah, I can't comment on that. I did see a memo from one of the law firms that works in this space discussing how there is some change to the legal definition of seeds in this language as well, but I have not reviewed that portion of it.
I will say before we move on to the next funding bill that we have to talk about, we get this question every week, no matter how many times we say it. Let's be real clear.
Yes, that is our position.
NORML has consistently called for the descheduling of marijuana. That means to remove it entirely from the Federal Controlled Substances Act, thus allowing sets to set their own policies without threat of federal interference. This is different from rescheduling. Those two processes happen differently. One happens by Congress, descheduling. Rescheduling is a potential administrative process, and they are not mutually exclusive, so they can both move forward at the same time. All right, let's get into the other funding bill that very ill-timed, right on the heels of Veterans Day. Congress approves the military funding bill that contains language affirming their position of denying veterans medical cannabis access.
Yeah, this was disappointing. Not terribly surprising, but somewhat surprising. And I say that because, again, like the USDA appropriations bill we were just discussing, this is another 1-year appropriations bill. The House had passed their version of the bill. The Senate had passed their version of the bill. Those two bills were not identical. And in order for a bill to go through both chambers and then move to the president's desk, there has to be one agreed upon, negotiated, final version of the language. And when the two chambers can't agree, what happens is a conference committee, a committee of a handful of members in leadership in both chambers are assigned to essentially hash out the differences between the two bills and come up with a final version, which is then approved. In this case, both the House version and the Senate version, while containing different language on a number of different issues, they both contained provisions that said we need to end this longstanding ban that prohibits VA doctors from formally issuing medical cannabis recommendations to patients in states that regulate medical cannabis. Both versions of the bill had a provision that said we're going to remove that restriction. We are now going to allow VA doctors to have these conversations and sign off on the necessary forms and paperwork so that their patients can legally access medical marijuana. And during conference committee, lawmakers made a conscious decision to identify that language and then remove it from the final version of the bill, and that is the version that was signed into law on Tuesday. So they could have done nothing. They could have simply said, well, a majority of the House wants this, a majority of the Senate wants this. Who are we to take this out and interfere with the process? But that wasn't the approach they took. Instead, they said, well, the handful of us, the 5 or 6 of us on this committee, we think we know better than the majority of the House and the majority of the Senate and the majority of the public. And we're going to remove this language that both chambers had previously agreed upon. And we're going to continue this cruel prohibition that says VA physicians, when they're seeing their patients with PTSD and chronic pain and these other conditions for which medical marijuana could help, we're going to continue by law to prohibit them from facilitating their patients from accessing medical cannabis. And they, as you said, they literally did it the day before Veterans Day.
Happy Veterans Day, everyone. Unbelievable, yet also entirely believable. Paul, just for everyone who's watching, I'm also dropping in the comments right now, in addition to links to these articles that we've been talking about, I dropped a link to our action alert, so you can tell members of Congress right now to let Veterans Affairs doctors recommend medical cannabis to their patients.
Yeah, and let's, I think it's important to stress why this is still important. I'm sure some folks are out there saying, well, many of these states have adult use markets. Why do these folks need to even go through the VA? Why can't they just find some private doctor independently and get a recommendation? Well, many of these veterans don't have the finances or the resources or the know-it-all to do that. They go to the VA for their medical treatment. That's their primary care physician. That's who they should be engaging in with these conversations. Those are the physicians that ought to be making this decision. And it is absurd to ask our veterans to go outside of that system to try to access medical cannabis when they should just be able to access it from their doctor. And we know full well that many VA doctors want to recommend medical cannabis.
Absolutely. We also know that a number of VA policies for veterans who are using opioids for pain management also are in conflict with state medical cannabis allowances. And if a veteran is going outside of the VA system and is participating in the state medical cannabis program, then they may not be able to access opioids or other controlled substances through the VA.
Correct.
Let's see. Yeah, Pam makes a great point. Pam says they failed our military. I know vets that it's actually helped from back in the Vietnam days. And Veronica says,
there's a poll out there showing that 75% of veterans say that they would elect to at least try medical cannabis if they knew they could safely access it. So again, this is something veterans want. This is something that their doctors want to recommend to them. And the only thing standing in the way is this long-standing federal prohibition that lawmakers could have done away with this week had they simply elected to keep the language passed by the House and passed by the Senate in the military reconstruction bill.
What a week it's been, Paul. What a week. Puna Seeds, I see your comments asking about where should we look to find the language around cannabis seeds and the retail market. Once the language is provided in entirety by the federal government, that'll probably be helpful. I haven't seen it posted yet. Maybe Tom has a comment. Maybe
Yes,
Tom's still
Tom
watching.
included a link in some of his initial reporting that took you to all of the pending agency appropriation bills, and
Mhm.
one could click on a link to those bills, but you're going to be wading through literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of language. In
Yeah,
order
I
to
did
get
some
through
looking, and what I was finding was the summary language, but it would be helpful if we had a link. Hey, Tom, send us that exact language. Okay, thanks. Um, so despite these wild choices by people that, for some reason, America, you continue to reelect to represent you, the American public has a different take on cannabis legalization. So let's talk about that story. Yes, yes, Tom Angel. Yes, the federal hemp language, please. Let's talk about how nearly 2/3 of U.S. adults favor legalizing marijuana, and this is a Gallup poll, and that wildly this year we saw a decrease in Republican support.
Yeah, again, in some ways, it's not that surprising to anyone that's sort of been paying attention. Gallup has been asking Americans with respect to their attitudes toward legalizing cannabis since 1969. I believe the first year they ever did so, about 9% of the public thought marijuana ought to be legal nationwide. And this year, it sits just over 2/3 of the country say that marijuana ought to be legal. But that breakdown has becoming more partisan in recent years. I believe 85% of Democrats responding to the Gallup poll said they thought marijuana ought to be legal, and 66% of independent voters said that they believe marijuana ought to be legal. We've seen over recent years a consistent rise in Democratic support for legalization, and support among independents has largely remained stable. But we saw this particular year a significant drop in self-identified Republican voters who said they supported legalization. It fell to 40%. Which was a significant drop when you consider that just a couple of years ago, 55% of Republican voters said they supported legalization. That percentage was the highest it has ever been for Republicans. So there's always been less support among Republicans for legalization than there has been among independents and Democrats. But this is the first time in many years we've seen a significant drop in support among Republicans, to the point that now it's certainly less than the majority of Republicans.
I looked at the raw data, and am, I'm sure you did too. I'm fairly certain that Republicans were the only minority group, and that everyone else was.
Yeah, when you break it down by age and other demographics,
Mhm.
yeah.
So it wasn't just old people. Wasn't just old
No,
people.
no, and I think, in some ways, it's indicative of, at least in some instances, I think these respondents are taking cues from their party and party leadership. And it's been very apparent in recent months and in recent years that the Republican Party and those in leadership are taking a hard turn on this particular issue. And they're certainly reinvigorating the war on drugs overall. And as you and I just talked about at the beginning of this show, they're not taking a laissez-faire attitude by any means when it comes to cannabis and cannabis consumers either. This is clearly being caught up in the larger messaging and the larger actions that the federal government and the Republican Party in particular are taking toward drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did go ahead and pull up those data, and 55 plus is 57%. And that's as low as it gets until you get to Republicans at 40%. Every other demographic is in the 60s or 70s or 80s.
Yeah, again, it's telling, but it shouldn't come as a surprise. When you look at the United States as a whole and you see the states that are regulating adult use cannabis markets, they are primarily blue leaning states. And in the handful of exceptions that are not, your states like Montana or Missouri, keep in mind the reason legalization exists in those states is because advocates put the question on the ballot and voters in those states passed those ballot questions, not because lawmakers in those Republican leaning states did anything to facilitate legalization. In many instances, they have done what they can to try to interfere with those policies becoming law. And in fact, right now, in a number of GOP-led states like Ohio, like Nebraska, lawmakers are actively trying to either roll back or overturn voters' demands on those ballot initiatives.
What a perfect segue you just set up there, Paul, to talk about our next topic. And I think that we're going to end up with a little extra time, so we could talk about not just Ohio, but let's maybe tap on Massachusetts and Maine also. But let's start with Ohio.
Sure. So Ohio in 2023, voters enacted legalization of the adult use marijuana market. It was a ballot question, issue 2. It passed by 57% over the objections of the GOP-led legislature. Actually, the way the process works in Ohio is that before the question goes to and is decided upon by the voters, the legislature actually has, I want to say, a 90-day or 100-day window with which they could proactively go ahead and enact the ballot question. They, of course, chose not to. They campaigned telling voters to reject the ballot question. Voters didn't listen to them, and they passed legalization. And from the moment that law was enacted, lawmakers in that state have set out to try to roll back many of the protections and the rights that were created by that law. So their first effort in 2024 was not successful. NORML and other groups pushed back really hard against that effort, and lawmakers got the message. And the timing mattered because there were elections coming up in November 2024. And lawmakers in Ohio did not want to take this unpopular stance and go against the will of the voters right before the election. Well, it's been a different story in 2025 because these lawmakers aren't up for re-election anytime soon, and they have once again introduced legislation to try to roll back many of these adult use protections. This is Senate Bill 56. That bill has passed the House. It's passed the Senate. Those two versions are not identical. Folks should be really understanding how this conference committee process works by now. So Ohio lawmakers had their own conference committee that is trying to finalize a version of Senate Bill 56. We have been actively lobbying that committee to try to repeal some of the worst provisions of this bill. That committee is meeting Tuesday, and this issue could be finalized at that time. But to give folks an idea of what is at stake here, lawmakers in Ohio are trying to repeal all of the anti-discrimination language that was in issue 2. So all of the language that says if you're a responsible adult consumer, you're not going to get penalized at work. You're not going to lose your professional licensure. You are not going to have your medical care compromised. If you go to a hospital and require an organ transplant, you're not going to have your parental rights trampled on. All that's gone in the version of Senate Bill 56 that's now in conference. There's also language in this bill that recriminalizes all sorts of behaviors that right now are legal in Ohio. If you are out in public and you have cannabis and it's not still in the original packaging you bought it in, that's a crime. If you're driving with cannabis in your car and it's not sealed in the original packaging and it's not in the trunk, that's a crime. If you have cannabis in public and you can't prove to a police officer that that cannabis was purchased from an Ohio dispensary or it was grown in Ohio, that's a crime. This is all in the bill that we have been fighting against now for months. NORML has delivered over 20,000 emails and letters and communications to lawmakers in Ohio. So many that certain lawmakers have publicly said on the record they're sick and tired of hearing from us. Well, if they're sick and tired from hearing from their constituents about this issue, what they ought to do then is stop complaining and actually do what their constituents want, which is to uphold the will of the people and to stop trying to undermine them.
20,109 emails from constituents have hit the inboxes of the Ohio legislature. Over 20,000. And that's just through our platform alone. That's a lot. That's a lot of emails.
It's a lot. And in the last 24 hours, about 1,000 folks have contacted the 6 members of the Ohio legislature who sit on that conference committee that ultimately are going to be the ones that decide the fate of Senate Bill 56 and decide whether Ohio voters' decisions in 2023 mattered or they didn't.
Yep. So friends, if you are in Ohio, if you have friends and family, anyone you know in Ohio, please share our action alert with them. I'll go ahead and add that one more time into the chat for everyone, but you can find this in the NORML Take Action Center, which is at norml.org/act. Click on the state you're looking for, and you'll find the action alerts for that state. Now, not only are we seeing this prohibitionist effort in Ohio, but we're also seeing prohibitionist attacks in both Massachusetts and Maine, right, Paul?
Yes, correct. And opponents are taking a different tactic in those 2 states. As hard in some ways as it is to believe, they are trying to repeal or undo legalization in those states that voters voted for by asking voters to undo legalization. They are pushing a pair of initiatives, one in the state of Massachusetts, one in the state of Maine, that seeks to overturn and repeal the adult use cannabis legalization markets in those states. It's a pretty bold move. And it's really the first time we've seen our political opponents try to undo a ballot initiative on this matter by proposing another ballot initiative. And from what we've heard so far, there's a good possibility that at least in Massachusetts, they may succeed on getting this on the ballot. I'm less certain about whether they will have success getting it on the ballot in Maine. But these are clearly trial balloons. If prohibitionists are successful at bringing these to the ballot and getting a popular vote, you would see them try to put these repeal measures on the ballot in state after state after state that has legalized adult use markets.
Yep, we do have action alerts. I've just dropped both of those in the chat for everyone. Make sure you're letting your representatives in Maine and Massachusetts know that you are not in favor of this effort and that you would like your lawmakers, your representatives to vocally oppose that as well. Let's see if we got any questions. Now's a great time to drop those in the comments, other than everyone hates them and wants them out of office. No, so ADHD grower says, so do they rearrest everybody they let out with marijuana charges? I don't think so. I don't think we'd be looking at anything like that. And I think it's a long shot that either of these efforts in Massachusetts or Maine pass, but it's not impossible, certainly, that they make
Yeah,
it
I
up.
think in Massachusetts, legalization is quite popular. It passed overwhelmingly. Maine was a different issue altogether. Yes, voters in Maine did approve legalization, but the vote was so close that it triggered a recount. I believe the margin was within 0.5%. So Maine did legalize marijuana, but they did so on a very narrow margin. Now, I would dare say legalization is much more popular in Maine now than it was at that time. But nonetheless, you can't take anything for granted. And if there's any message that I've been harping on this last year or so, is that this is not the time to walk away from cannabis advocacy. This is not the time to rest on one's laurels because our political opponents haven't gone away. They're re-energized, they're motivated, and they're pushing back. And that means we have to push back that much harder. We have that much more work to do because we're not just pushing for additional reforms. We're also working really, really hard right now to simply maintain the gains, the hard-fought gains that we've won over the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Virginia is a great example state for that. We've just spent 4 years making sure we didn't lose anything in that state, that we were able to advance through the legalization measure in 2021. And the administration that the state has now is very prohibitionist, has made multiple attempts to recriminalize and to roll back efforts, has vetoed measures. And I know that state is looking forward to a new governor in January and finally moving forward with some more meaningful cannabis policy reform at the state level there. We do have a question about Hawaii and West Virginia. Puna Seed says, what efforts are being made by Hawaii's legislatures? And I know there was just fairly recently a hearing in Hawaii, right, Paul?
Yeah, Hawaii's legislature is actually quite conservative on this issue. There's a lot of unique issues in play in Hawaii that aren't necessarily as in play in other states. And Hawaii has been very frustrating over the last few years because even when it is looked like we have had a pathway to enacting modest reform measures, like expanding the amount of marijuana that is decriminalized in Hawaii, those efforts have failed. And it is going to be very difficult this coming year to turn that tide around. I've already had talks with some of my colleagues who really have targeted Hawaii, and they're not particularly hopeful about the prospects there.
I hope that answered your question, Puna. And to your follow-up question about, do we have a NORML chapter in Hawaii? No, we do not. If you would like to start one, you can learn more at norml.org/chapters, or you can just send an email to normal@norml.org. It's a real email, and we'll both see it. Let's see. There was a West Virginia comment as well. Steve said West Virginia was pushing for adult use, but it seems stalled now.
Yeah. So, let's be clear. Most states, their legislative sessions only meet for a few months out of the year. So a state like West Virginia, Hawaii, the majority of states we're talking about, their legislatures are not in session right now. They haven't been in session in most cases for many months. They will reconvene early in 2026. Except for Texas, because they have an every other year session and they will not be in session at all next year. So that is the time, that window between January and May for most states is when individuals who live in those states have the ability to make the most impact. That's when bills are introduced. That's when they're being debated. That's when they have the opportunity to move forward. Once the state lawmakers are out of session, they're not paying attention to these issues, and they're not going to be until they're back in session again. Again, there are some exceptions to that rule. We've talked about Ohio. They are in session all year. Michigan's in session all year. California's in session a good part of the year, but those are the exceptions. Most state lawmakers are only in session for a few months out of the year. As you know, JM, Virginia may have the shortest session of any state. It's only a few weeks.
Yep, we have a 4-week session and a 6-week session, depending on the year. It's great. I will say, Steve, that because your legislature is not in session, we can get the generic West Virginia adult use action alert back up. I'm going to write an actual paper note right now to get that back up. There are a number of alerts for states that do not have legal cannabis access at a meaningful level. We've got Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Hawaii, Idaho, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Wyoming, all not adult use states. There are action alerts just up all the time for those states at the top of our Take Action Center, and we can go ahead and reactivate West Virginia as well.
I think you talked about it last week, but West Virginia is the only state that currently collects taxes on medical cannabis, but actually doesn't spend any of that money that they collect, because it is being argued by the state treasurer that somehow doing so would violate federal law.
It's the West Virginia treasurer is sitting on $34 million that has been explicitly directed to fund very specific programs and line items by state law. And the treasurer is just saying, no, we're not going to do what state law says. We're just going to keep this money in the credit union until federal law changes.
Right.
Because somehow West Virginia is a special boy. They're the only state that somehow is regulating cannabis and doesn't know how to use tax revenue.
They're regulating cannabis in violation of federal law. They're collecting taxes from those activities, but they won't spend the money because that would violate federal law, and they don't want to violate federal law. That's the argument.
That way. Yeah. And all the other ways is fine. Oh, it's always comical when a state, and I think every state does this, they think that they are the most special one ever, the first one to ever do anything.
They don't bother to have discussions with regulators or lawmakers in other states that have been doing these things for, in some cases, decades.
But boy, when they come to us, do they like to say, well, we need to study what other states have done. Good news. We know. We can just tell you. We're real sure, after 2 decades of real world regulatory experience with cannabis in the United States, we're sure what happens.
Yes.
Yeah. Chris, that is far too big of a question. What is the war on drugs and how many people have been murdered because of it? Far more than we'll ever be able to calculate, I'm sure. Looking around, let me see if we have any other questions.
We can also talk about marijuana arrests if you want. I think you may have touched on the topic last week.
We did touch on that last week, but let's do it again, Paul, because if there was any doubt amongst anyone at this point how alive and well prohibition is in the United States of America, look no further than the marijuana arrest numbers provided by the FBI for 2024.
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight this because so often there's a narrative out there, oftentimes that you hear when cannabis and cannabis policy is discussed. It's usually discussed from a sort of a post-prohibition lens. And on the one hand, I take that as a compliment. It shows how much progress we've made. It shows that we've successfully done our job. But it's not accurate because in 26 states, marijuana under state law is still illegal. And in those states, many people are still arrested for minor marijuana violations. So what we saw from the FBI's latest data is a little over 200,000 Americans in 2024 were arrested for marijuana-related violations. Well over 90% of those were for possession of marijuana, not for trafficking, not for other marijuana-related activities, but simply for low-level possession. But that sort of skews that nationwide figure, sort of implies that marijuana arrests or low-level marijuana arrests are sort of equally spread out throughout the country. And that's not the case at all. In fact, 3 states, Texas, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania in 2024 contributed to more than 50,000 of those marijuana-related arrests. And when you add in an additional 5 other states, those 8 states account for over 100,000 of those low-level marijuana-related arrests. So prohibition is very, very alive and well in certain jurisdictions of this country. And in other jurisdictions, those jurisdictions where cannabis is legally regulated, arrests have, in some cases, fallen almost to zero.
So in 2024, and for everyone watching, this is the latest data from the FBI, or 2024 numbers. We're not a year behind. That's just what we've gotten so far. 8 states, as you mentioned, had over 100,000 marijuana arrests, and that's more than half.
Yeah. Again, so
low-level marijuana arrests.
We see a small number of states are now responsible for the overwhelming majority of marijuana arrests nationwide. And
Texas takes the cake with over 26,000, almost 27,000 of those arrests. And then we've got
that's about 25% of all the arrests that took place in this country.
We've got Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia are at the top of the worst.
All prohibition states.
Absolutely.
And again, to be clear, and I know, JM, it sounds like you've got the numbers in front of you, but these are marijuana possession arrests. There are some states in that list where marijuana possession comprised 99% of all the marijuana-related arrests that were made that year in that state.
And that's important for people to remember. This is not the state cracking down on drug dealers. This is the state arresting people for smoking a joint.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I know you've done a diligent job getting all those figures up on our site. You might want to direct folks to where they can go to see the marijuana arrest data for their particular state. And if you live in a state where cannabis is still illegal, you need to be sharing those numbers with your lawmakers, because far too often, and JM, you know this, you and I hear, well, nobody goes to jail for marijuana. No one's arrested for marijuana. Police don't really care about making marijuana busts anymore. That narrative is simply not true. And the numbers belie it.
It really isn't true. And I have that link. I am going to drop the link in the chat now to our state marijuana arrest reports. You can click on your state and see how many marijuana specific arrests were reported to the FBI in 2024. Because of course, as we said before, Paul, not every state is reporting at all or reporting the totality of their arrests.
Yeah. So at this point, I think every state had some law enforcement agencies that reported, but you'll also see if folks go to that page, we include the percentage of law enforcement agencies in the state that do report. In some states, it might be 90%. In other states, Florida's notorious for this, it might be only about 40%.
And this year, we weren't even able to see the number of.
That's right. And this year, the FBI did not provide that data.
Yeah. Quinn says, my lawmaker speaks like foghorn leghorn. Thank you for Thank you for the levity, Quinn. I appreciate it. All right, friends. Let's all say thank you to Paul for joining us. I'm going to do a quick look here and see if there's... Oh, okay. Well, let's see. We have one question before you go, Paul. On Instagram, Southbound Cannabis says, Texas here. This is about the federal stuff. Is the 1-year window for enforcement of this bill standard practice for this kind of bill?
No.
Or was it stretched out to anticipate a regulation bill to be produced? Perhaps both are true. I don't think
no,
it is.
on the second as well. It was stretched out because there was a recognition, even among the folks in Congress who want to shut down this entire marketplace, that it wouldn't be reasonable for folks that have invested their money and to create these businesses to just wipe them out of existence overnight. So the idea was that it was reasonable to give these folks a year to wind down their businesses. That was the mindset behind the 1-year window.
Right, but more importantly, it's a whole year to collect your lobbying money from these businesses.
That's true too. And it's also potentially, a year for these businesses, their trade groups, and the consumers that patronize these businesses to try to flex their muscle as well and tell Congress they made a mistake and that they need to reverse course.
Yeah, absolutely. And above all else, hey, you've got a year, America, to elect better people wherever you live. Stop electing people who are terrible on cannabis policy unless you want terrible cannabis policies. There you go.
Absolutely.
Paul, thanks for joining us. Always appreciate it.
Thank you, JM. Thanks everybody out there for streaming in, and have a great rest of your show and have a great weekend.
Thank you. All right, friends, we are going to talk about some events that we have coming up. You are welcome to throw any burning questions that you've got left over for me in the chat right now. Take a second, hit that like, follow, or subscribe button so you never miss when NORML goes live, and help boost us in the algorithm wherever you're watching so we can reach even more Americans who care about ensuring the rights of responsible cannabis consumers, just like you all do. That's what we do here at NORML. That's what we've done for 55 years, and that's what we're going to continue doing, because we are the only organization out there that solely represents consumers and works to protect their rights. No frogs, the show is not quite over, but we're getting close, my friend. We're getting close. So definitely drop your comments, your questions in there right now. Fried Mouse, do I know when 2026 member cards will be available? I can tell you that membership cards are a little different at the moment, and instead of being the calendar year, they look different. So you'll get something different. That's how they look different. They're supposedly specific to you now. You're welcome, Southbound. Thank you for your question. Oh, hey, Radhika. Thank you for joining us. Radhika says, thanks for the incoming small business and science-friendly. Thanks to the incoming small business and science-friendly Virginia administration coming in. Home Baked is reopening January 24th in Reston, Virginia. Glad to see you here. Since you mentioned Virginia, that's a great segue, Radhika, to talk about some big events that we have coming up in Virginia. Of course, 2026 Virginia Cannabis Conference will be December 4th. No, wrong month. Will be January 23rd through 25th in Richmond, Virginia. Dropping that in the comments right now. It is at virginiacannabisconference.com. That following Monday, January 26th, will be Virginia NORML's Lobby Day. Hope you all will join Virginia NORML for that. It's a free event. Please register in advance. This is the opportunity for cannabis consumers to share their thoughts with Virginia state lawmakers, because most important, there is no cannabis industry without cannabis consumers. Lawmakers need to know that your priorities are the real priorities, not corporate interests. Now, before the end of the year, we have in fact, before the end of this weekend, we have a deadline that I need you to know about. If you have not taken NORML's 2025 Cannabis Consumer Survey, please do. This is really helpful for us in seeing what your policy priorities and concerns are, so we can better represent the interests of cannabis consumers in our lobbying, in our organizing, our outreach, and our educational efforts. And if you get your response in by midnight tomorrow, so midnight on Saturday, so today's Friday, right? November 15th is Saturday. Get your survey response in by midnight tomorrow, and you can be entered into our drawing to win a $100 gift card to the NORML store. I see that, Jeremy. I see that. Hilarious. So please take the Cannabis Consumer Survey. If you know any other consumers out there who you think might want to take it, that'd be great. Thank you to High Times and to Marijuana Moment for promoting our survey to their audiences. Really, really appreciate that, friends. And then this December is the 2025 NORML Key West Legal Seminar. This will be at the Hyatt Centric this year, December 4th through 6th. Registration is still open at norml.org/Key West. Make plans to join myself and Paul there. If you are an attorney, our legal seminars are fully accredited in every state that requires CLEs for practicing attorneys, so we have you covered there. If you're not an attorney, or maybe you just don't need CLEs, we have a discounted rate for you. So either way, we have your back, and you do not have to be an attorney to attend this event. It is a really excellent opportunity to connect with legal experts from around the country as we work our way from marijuana prohibition to cannabis freedom. And there are definitely going to be a lot of really interesting conversations had at this event now that we've seen this action in the federal funding bills by Congress. Better state regulations in Virginia and North Carolina. I think I see your comment, OG Grandma. I think those states are miles apart when it comes to regulations. We have some really great regulations for medical cannabis in Virginia. Meanwhile, we've got nothing going on in North Carolina. Hopefully, Virginia legalizes adult use retail in 2026 finally and puts some heat on North Carolina. That would really be great for that state. All right, those are all of our events. We did everything. And listen, if you're just joining us, hey, we're almost done, but you don't have to miss anything. NORML's Weekend Weed Read comes out tomorrow morning at about 9 a.m. Eastern. And all of these stories and more could just be delivered to your inbox. NORML News of the Week comes out on Thursday. NORML Weekend Weed Read comes out on Saturday. You can get both of those by going to norml.org/subscribe. Drop your email and your zip code in there. Check the Weekend Weed Read box, and you're subscribed. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I am just going to assume you're talking to us. All good things and all good time. Who says you are what good people look like? I like to think so. We try. We're here to represent you, the responsible cannabis consumer. That's what we've been doing since 1970, and that's what we're going to continue to do as long as we can. You can help us do this work by donating, by clicking that stars button and giving us stars. You can join the fundraiser on YouTube. You can donate to NORML at norml.org/donate anytime. Please do so. We really need your support. And remember, NORML is powered by people like you, not by corporations. We rely heavily on small dollar donors at an average $20 donation. So please, now's a great time to join if you haven't yet. All right, friends, this has been a blast. I like hanging out with you all on Fridays, and let's just do a quick look to see what we're looking at for next Friday. It looks like next Friday is going to be a good time for a show before we have a week off for the holidays. So be sure you hit that like, follow, or subscribe button so you never miss when NORML goes live. I'm JM Pedini, the development director here at NORML. And as always, I'll see you right back here next time. Bye-bye.